On June 10th, during the 31st edition of the Conference of Montreal, Scott Brison, Vice Chair of BMO Wealth Management, sat down with Patrick Decostre, President and CEO of Boralex, to discuss the headwinds that renewable energy companies face.
Welcome to Markets Plus, where leading experts from across BMO discuss factors shaping the markets, economy, industry sectors, and much more. Visit bmocm.com/Markets Plus for more episodes. The views expressed here are those of the participants and not those of BMO Capital Markets, its affiliates, or subsidiaries.
Patrick Decostre. And Boralex is one of those great Quebec and Canadian success stories, a global leader in alternative energy, 35-year history. And Patrick, you were the first employee for Boralex in France, and you built Boralex over a period of
18 years
to being the number one onshore wind energy company provider in France before becoming CEO. Boralex is a leader globally in energy transition. And what is your edge or strategic advantage from your competitors?
We have always been an industrial, not just a promoter who is developing projects and selling them, not just an investor, but an industrial with engineers, blue collars doing maintenance. We have this history because we have been created by Cascade, the paper and pulp company, the Lemaire family. And I think this mindset changed because all over the last 35 years, we have extended what we do in the value chain. So we have these different skills internally. So that's the main point. I think the second point is we have gone through many crises and changes. All the people are speaking about today's volatility. And it's sure, there is lots of volatility. But I arrived 11 days before 9/11. And then there was the Enron crisis. Then there was the great financial crisis. The main challenge of today is to stay nimble, but to do lots of projects which are $500 million to over $1 billion investment in different jurisdictions.
So you've actually lived through and been building Boralex during a lot of events that made it more complicated sometimes to raise capital in the financing environment. Would you say that we've gone from a finance environment of irrational optimism to perhaps irrational pessimism, and that the reality of sustainable finance is probably better than a lot of people believe, and maybe Boralex, because of your experience, perhaps that's an edge, having that experience and that resilience?
Yeah, I think as a CEO and as a team, we have to stay quite calm in both situations. When there is too much optimism in the market, it will end up in the A. And when there is too much pessimism, it's the same. We're there for the long term, and it's the classic quote is to make the difference between the long-term signal and the noise. But we are specifically there. The reality is, I think, the need of more energy, more power, specifically electricity, is important. What we're seeing in Europe, in France specifically, where we have contracts which are not just with the local Hydro-Québec EDF, we have contract with Saint-Gobain, we have contract with Nestlé, we have contract with IBM. So big corporations are buying electricity, and specifically for the reason that they want to be sure that they have electricity at the next gas crisis in Europe and have access to electricity, because they don't want to be exposed to the peak of price that they have been exposed 2-3 years ago with the Ukrainian war and the difficulty on the nuclear fleet in France. So this is the long-term signal. And in the US, it's the same.
Canada has a new Prime Minister Carney, and he was here at this conference, I believe, 2 or 3 years ago. prior to entering politics, and at that time he spoke about sustainable finance. So you've got a prime minister who has quite a breadth and depth of understanding of sustainable finance. He also has an ambition as prime minister for Canada to become an energy superpower in conventional and clean energy. And a new minister, Tim Hodgson, charged with that responsibility. And the very capable Marc-André Blanchard is his chief of staff, who knows a lot about this realm and business and getting things done. What would your advice be to Prime Minister Carney and his government in terms of public policy and considerations around things like ITC provisions?
The first advice is not to create disruptions. If you want to build Canada as a superpower in energy, it means you need lots of investment. You need investment in generation like we do. You need investment in transmission. And you don't want to have a disruption of this investment flow. So even if, and we are making fictions, but if the IRA is repealed completely, the reflex of Canada could be to say we have to repeal the ITC too because it was a reply to the IRA. I think it would not be a good idea. We have experience, if you go back in 2018, Ontario, Quebec, BC, for different political reasons, decide to say we don't need electricity anymore. We don't need renewable anymore. Look to what happens 2 years, 3 years ago to say, no, we need it and it's urgent. You don't want to be in this situation. So that's the first point, stability. And the second point, which is incredibly important, is permitting. What is very difficult, even in our business, it's the permitting process. Obviously, there is constraint. Obviously, we have to make impact study and check all the things from visual, landscape, biodiversity, noise, everything. But on the other side, we need to do that in a short, reasonable period to be sure, and it should be stable afterwards. What you don't want is to build something, to decide an investment, and then you have another change. So stability is the important word.
And government fiscal capacity today is more limited than I think a lot of people realize. And U.S. government debt to GDP is something around 110 or 120%, depending on how you measure it. In Canada, federal gross debt as a percentage of GDP is around 80%. You put in the provincial ones, 35% or so. That's about twice what the Maastricht Treaty requirement was in 1992 to join the euro, 60%. So we haven't had a Liz Truss moments yet over here, but the four most expensive words in the English language are this time it's different. And from your perspective, you've got as your major shareholder CDPQ. What public policy should we be thinking about and implementing to make our projects, your projects, better targets for investment from global pools of capital, institutional investors, pension funds from around the world?
What we have in Quebec, we have 30 years contract with Hydro-Quebec, and it's through competitive process. So at the end, Hydro-Quebec has a good price for this electricity. The good news is when I start with Boralex, the duration of the contract in wind or in CHP were 12 years. No, the equipment have a longer duration, and we have proven that, and it's financiable. So you amortize on a longer period. So it reduces the cost. That's one thing. So this is really attractive. So it's protecting the investment. And again, it's through a competitive process. So it's the best price, and price is almost the only element in the competitive bids. So I think that is what is attracting long-term investor in our business, definitely. What is the exact opposite is when everything is changing and you just have a spot market, and then you cannot invest. And at the end, you pay more. The price of power is higher than when you have a stability of your contract on the long term.
Switching channels a little bit, how do you find the global talent environment these days and attracting the talent you need to grow, and also supply chain issues? Of course, COVID created a lot of disruption. Have things settled down on the supply chain side and costs adjusted more moderately over the last while?
On the talent side, this is the only differentiator for a company. I'm often saying that to my team. The real differentiator is going in and out of the door every day. So we really need to attract the best people. And typically presently, we're trying to take advantage of the offshore trouble, I would call that like this, in the US, to bring people who have experience of building multi-billion-dollar project and have project manager coming with us. Definitely at Boralex, we are also attracting people from France here in Canada. So it's something that is important, and it's a big change because when I joined the company, there were some people operating a big plant in the northeast of the US in biomass. We sold this plant, but the real development operation people were 60. We're 800. So it's completely different situation to bring people when you're 800 and have a brand and when you're 60. So this is one thing. And your second question was supply chain. Yeah, supply chain. The wind turbine cost increased between 21 to 23 by roughly 40%. So that was a huge impact of the supply chain disruptions. And no, it's a situation where the turbine manufacturer, due to the questioning in the US, are looking to the next 2 years because they're booked for the next 2 years, but after that, they don't know really what is the situation because there's lack of investment decision. So it's going down. But the situation also, I come back to my point, changed a lot the last 10 years. 10 years ago, there was probably 10 turbine suppliers. Now there is 3. So the competition is completely different. And that's, again, something about stability. If you want to attract suppliers, you need to give them stability.
It's been a privilege for all of us to be able to benefit from Patrick Decostre's unique perspective, experience, and vision for the future for Boralex. And I want to thank you, Patrick, and I'd like all of you to join with me to appreciate Patrick for his leadership at Boralex and giving us a first row seat into that vision as he's executing and building an even bigger global champion for Quebec and Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. You can follow this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. For more episodes, visit bmocm.com/marketsplus.
For BMO disclosures, please visit bmocm.com/podcast/disclaimer.